Whilst the opium trade in the 18th and 19th centuries was dominated by the British, there were some American families that became involved in the later decades. The influence on China of these families and the influence of various institutions set up by them continued on well after the opium trade had declined in importance and profitability. One such institution was Yale University, which in 1901 set up Yale in China as a means of educating the Chinese and to build Chinese institutional capacity. It succeeded admirably in both aims. As was the norm then, and is still the norm today, some kind of cover organisation or explanation was used to disguise the real intention of such bodies. In Yale's case, they claimed Yale in China was a religious missionary group. After the US enabled the Soviet communists to take power and began building their economy, as Professor Sutton has copiously documented, Mao and the Chinese communists turned to Stalin and the Soviet Union to assist them in their struggle with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. With the Soviet Union taking control of Outer Mongolia and Xinjiang province, they were able to arm and train the Chinese communists with the weapons and materials produced in their American, German and Western European built factories. It was not until after the first Soviet five-year plan from 1928 to 1932 that the Soviets could assist the Chinese in any meaningful way. Hence, in 1934, the Long March of the Chinese Communists to Xinjiang took place. As expected when examining the history of communism, the truth about the Long March is vastly different from the communist propaganda about that event. Following Chiang Kai-shek's betrayal by two of his generals in 1936, he agreed to a truce with Mao and the Communists, and they were allowed to build up their strength in territories controlled by the Soviet Union without opposition from the nationalists. There they were trained and armed by the Americans directly, as we shall see, or indirectly via the Soviet communists, who the Americans and Germans trained and supplied with the factories and technologies to conduct a war. The OSS played a major role in equipping and training the Chinese communists. Another American of major importance in ensuring that Mao and the Communists took power in China was George C. Marshall, the US Chief of Staff during World War II. Marshall, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, was involved in President Roosevelt's New Deal and was posted to China from 1924 to 1927, during which time he learnt Mandarin. He pretended to be neutral in the conflict between the nationalists and the communists, but in fact he ensured that the communists would triumph. As per usual, the American media and pro-globalist communist think tanks actively played their part in Mao's brutal dictatorship taking power. Roosevelt, the State Department and various military and OSS/CIA operatives used Chinese communism to expand the powers of the US government and military industrial complex and to increase the wealth of various financiers involved behind the scenes, just as they had done in relation to Soviet communism. It is widely agreed amongst researchers in this field that Mao and the Chinese communists were responsible for the deaths of 40 to 50 million Chinese before Mao died in 1976. Once the Chinese communists took power, the US lost no time in making use of them to keep their military-industrial complex growing. The great expansion in state power that had occurred due to the New Deal and World War II, and the huge profits that flowed from those programs, needed to be kept going. President Roosevelt asked Stalin to enter the Pacific War against Japan and gave him substantial supplies to do so. On the 10th of August, the US divided the Korean Peninsula in two, giving the northern half to the Soviets, even though the Soviet Union only entered the conflict 1 day previously and only 6 days before Japan surrendered on the 15th of August 1945. Such was their rush to make sure that future conflict was easily achievable. The Soviets then trained and equipped some North Korean soldiers and reached an agreement with Chairman Mao to send Chinese troops to assist in their invasion of the South. A profitable period then ensued as American and Western corporations made money selling war materials and supplies to all three combatants, the US, the Soviet Union, and the Chinese. For example, Rolls-Royce sold jet engines to the Soviets, which they used in their MiG-15s during the Korean War, attacking United States forces and Air Force. After 3 years of war, everything was arranged for a truce to be called back at the original US-created border. So successful was this exercise for the US, they tried to do the same thing in Vietnam, but the Vietnamese had other ideas. Having two more fake enemies, China and North Korea, meant that the US could set up military and naval bases around the China Pacific region and produce even more nuclear missiles, etc. As in the case of the Soviet Union, it was necessary to show that these enemies had nuclear capabilities, especially long-range nuclear missiles. In this case, however, their efforts to explain how the Chinese communists obtained such a capacity took a rather farcical turn. By now, the Americans had begun to believe their own think tank and CIA spy propaganda. This caused them to choose a particularly strange course which only the most naive intellectuals and academics could even begin to accept. Since China was very backward industrially and going through sustained turmoil due to Mao's psychopathic behaviour, it had no capacity to produce any of the requirements necessary for a nuclear program or missile. Therefore, a Chinese genius spy, educated and trained in the US, was manufactured to explain how China obtained such advanced technologies. Hence the saga of Xian Sui Zhen. Nowadays, such stories are rightfully called clown world. China now has the factories and the engineers and the machines and the technologies to produce the required missiles and nuclear devices, But back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, only the United States had such a capacity. As Professor Sutton shows, the US allowed the Soviet communists to acquire the necessary technologies, with the CIA even overruling the Department of Defense on one occasion. In the case of the Chinese communists, either the Americans supplied China directly with the necessary expertise, factories, machines, etc., or did so via the Soviet Union. Allowing a known spy to return to China was just a rather clownish cover story. With the advent to power of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union in 1985 and the subsequent collapse of the whole Soviet system in 1991, the Chinese communists, now led by Deng Xiaoping, correctly understood that they needed to radically reassess their whole approach to communism so as to not fall into the same trap. This they did very successfully and cleverly. Whilst the United States of America has destroyed itself in a rather messy and idiotic manner, the Chinese have patiently abided their time and built up their strength.